11.5 Plan Risk Responses. Plan risk responses is the process of developing options, selecting strategies and agreeing on actions to address overall project risk exposure as well as to treat individual project risks. The key benefit of this process is that it identifies appropriate ways to address overall project risk and individual project risks. This process also allocates resources and inserts activities into the project documents and the project management plan as needed. This process is performed throughout the project, and that's from the PMBOK Guide, page 437. This is actually my favourite part of risk management. Risk responses are the part of risk management that most people get wrong, and I believe this is because they rely on everyday meanings of the words. But by now you know that the PMBOK Guide has a special meaning for many words and phrases that we otherwise use in everyday language. If you're familiar with the PRINCE2 Guide, Managing Successful Projects in PRINCE2 2017 edition, then much of what I'm covering is going to be similar. But however, there are some important differences. We have now I should say actually that if you're familiar with PMBOK Guide previous to the 6th edition, of course much of us will be familiar, but there are important differences that have been introduced with the 6th edition. Okay, we've identified and assessed the risks and recorded them in a risk register, so now we need to develop plans to deal with them as well as we can and assign a risk owner to each to ensure they get implemented. Traps to avoid include making one person the owner of all risks, making the project manager a risk owner, and assigning risks to people who don't have the authority to implement the risk responses. As per the old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. You need to ensure that your risk treatment strategies are robust and sensible. Otherwise, the whole risk management chain of plan, identify, qualify, quantify, respond, implement and monitor will pull apart like a 50-cent necklace with the first gentle tug. There's an old joke about the Swiss wristwatch with a lifetime guarantee. If the mainspring breaks, it slashes your wrist. Poorly planned risk management has a similar guarantee. It guarantees the project manager's life and the project will be cut short. Note that so far we have been considering only negative risks, also known as threats or pure risks. And you will find that on most projects that is where the main focus is rather than on the opportunities. And exceptions to that would be a number of the startups where they're risking a lot, but the outcomes could be very high as well. The project manager should consider how to respond appropriately to the current level of overall project risk as well as individual risks. Each risk considered individually will be within the organization's risk appetite profile, but when viewed as a whole, there may be enough combined risks to worry the hungriest stakeholders. For example, if you have 100 risks, you'd expect perhaps 20% to occur. But if your analysis indicates a much higher percentage, then you might want to reconsider the whole project. Risk responses should be appropriate for the significance of the risk, cost effective in meeting the challenge, realistic within the project context, agreed upon by all parties involved, and owned by a responsible person. There's no point in implementing a response that costs a lot more than the expected damage from the risk. For example, when I'm posting certificates of completion to some of the graduates from some of my courses, I print them on high quality paper. They cost me about 30 cents to print, which includes the envelope and the cardboard backing. Postage is $2 per certificate. If I want to send one by registered mail, that costs $4 more. And if I want to insure it, that costs another $5. And it can't be insured unless it's registered. So to insure it, that's $9 total for on top of the cost of certificate and postage. I could choose a transference response. The transference response costs $4 plus $5 equals $9 for registration and insurance. But if I don't insure the certificate and it gets lost, the cost of sending a replacement one is just $2.30. Okay, what is the cost of the risk response? As we'll see later, acknowledging that the risk can occur but doing nothing about it is actually a risk response called acceptance. Selecting the optimal risk response from several options is often required, as we've just seen. The strategy or mix of strategies most likely to be effective should be selected for each risk. Structured decision-making techniques may be used to choose the most appropriate response to use. For large and complex projects, it may be appropriate to use a mathematical optimization model or real options analysis as a basis for alternate risk response strategies. Specific actions are developed to implement the agreed upon risk management strategy, including primary and backup strategies as necessary. A contingency plan or a fallback plan, they aren't the same thing, can be developed for implementation if the selected strategy turns out not to be fully effective or if an accepted risk occurs. Secondary risks should also be identified. What's a secondary risk? A secondary risk is a risk that arises as a direct result of implementing a risk response. Whenever I was a teenager, I had a speedboat with a 25 horsepower outboard motor. Eventually I saved up enough money to buy a 100 horsepower motor. There was a risk that the transom, which is the flat back of the boat that the motor clamps onto, would crack with the extra power. My risk response was to glue a thick sheet of wood onto the transom to double its thickness and greatly reduce the risk of the transom cracking. But after a few weeks of violent acceleration, the sides of the boat began to crack. This happened as a direct result of my risk response. If I had enough experience at the time, I would have been able to identify this as a secondary risk and responded by strengthening the sides as well. A contingency reserve is often allocated for time and cost, along with details of the conditions that trigger its use. Plan risk responses inputs. Input number 1, project management plan. And our components we're interested in would be the resource management plan, because that's used to help determine how resources allocated to agreed upon risk responses will be coordinated with other project resources. For example, do we set extra resources aside, or will we buy them as needed whenever the risk occurs? Risk management plan. The risk management roles and responsibilities and risk thresholds are used in this process, and the cost baseline, it is information on the contingency fund that is allocated to respond to the risks. Input number 2, project documents, which would include the lessons learned register, the project schedule, because then you'll see the agreed upon risk responses, you have to schedule those in. Project team assignments can show the resources that will be allocated to agreed upon risk responses. Resource calendars to identify the potential resources when they're available to be allocated to agreed upon risk responses. The risk register, because it contains details of individual project risks that have been identified and prioritized and for which risk responses are required, along with the name of the risk owner. Which low priority risks you may not have to do anything about beyond just making a note and be watchful of them. The risk register identifies the nominated risk owner for each risk. The risk report, it presents the current level of overall risk exposure of the project that will inform selection of a risk response strategy. The risk report may also list individual project risks in priority order and provide additional analysis of the distribution of individual project risks that may inform risk response selection. And the stakeholder register to identify potential risk owners for the risk responses. Input number 3, enterprise environmental factors, would include the risk appetite and risk thresholds of key stakeholders. Number 4 is the organizational process assets, which would include the templates for risk management plan, risk register and the risk report, historical databases and lessons learned repositories from similar projects. Plan risk responses tools and techniques. Number 1 is expert judgment, and it'd be worth your while going through all of the various processes and learning the ones which don't use expert judgment. There's very few of them because, as I've said many times, the exam likes to test you on exceptions, and they're more likely to ask something about a process that doesn't use expert judgment than something that does. Expertise should be considered from individuals or groups with specialised knowledge or training in the following topics: threat response strategies, opportunity response strategies, contingent response strategies, and overall project risk response strategies. Expert input may be sought from individuals with particular subject matter expertise relevant to a specific individual project risk. For example, where specialist technical knowledge is required. And as I mentioned before, if you don't have that expertise in the company, you might consider employing someone, getting a contractor or whatever to cover that particular area if it's sufficiently important. Tools and techniques. Number 2, data gathering, and in this case it's really just interviews. Tools and techniques. Number 3, interpersonal and team skills. Really what we're just looking at here is that facilitation, because a skilled facilitator can help identify and compare alternative possible risk response strategies that can help the risk owners actually understand what the risk is and help them understand the implications of the chosen strategy, and they can also help to identify and overcome sources of bias within the risk owners. Tools and techniques. Number 4, strategies for threats. The strategies are the core of risk management. No matter how much work you put in before this stage, you will not have actually accomplished anything unless you devise responses to manage the risks. 5 alternative strategies may be considered for dealing with threats as follows. Escalate. If you're familiar with PMBOK Guide but you've not heard of Escalate before, it's because it's just been added with the release of the PMBOK Guide 6th edition. The PMB exam likes to test you on new additions to the PMBOK Guide, and so I'd expect this to appear now and then. Escalation is used when the project team or the project sponsor agrees that a threat is outside the scope of the project or that the proposed response would exceed the project manager's authority. Escalated risks are managed at the program level, portfolio level, or other relevant part of the organisation and not on the project level. The project manager determines who should be notified about the threat and communicates the details to that person as part of the organisation. This means that the risk owner must be at a level of authority to implement the response. Please note this for the exam too. If a threat is escalated, it is no longer monitored by the project team because it is effectively outside the project. Personally, I don't agree with this, and whenever I have escalated risks in the past, I have continued to have them monitored, but the PMBOK Guide says they aren't monitored, and that's what the examination question will expect you to say as well. Avoid. Risk avoidance is where the project team acts to eliminate the threat or protect the project from its impact. It may be appropriate for high priority threats with a high probability of occurrence and a large negative impact. Note that 90% of my students get this one wrong. If you're familiar with the PRINCE2 guide, you will see that this treatment is the same in PRINCE2. Avoid means removing the risk completely by taking away the cause of the threat or completely protecting the project against it. This is normally achieved by removing a part of the scope. Very important, if you apply this treatment and there's still a 0.0000001% of it happening, then you've not avoided it. The probability must be 0%. For example, your project is to build 3 explosives manufacturing plants in the United States, and they must be no further than 300 miles apart. Location 1 and Location 2 have been assessed as very safe locations. Location 3, however, is to be built in California, which is the earthquake capital of the US. No matter how you plan, the risk of explosion through earthquake remains high. So you avoid the risk by deciding not to build a plant in California. As there's no plant, there is zero risk. Building the plant at another location US within the 300-mile limit has a greater than 0% chance of an earthquake risk. The risk owner may also take action to isolate the project's objectives from the risk's impact if it were to occur. Example of avoidance actions may include removing the cause of a threat, extending the schedule, changing the project strategy, or reducing scope. Some risks may be avoided by clarifying requirements, obtaining information, improved communication, or acquiring expertise. But whatever the bottom line is, it must be 0% possibility of the risk occurring. And for that reason, I do disagree with the BIMBOK guide on an avoidance strategy of acquiring expertise, because even if you acquire expertise, there is a greater than 0% chance that that expert may be wrong, might make a mistake. But if that's accepted in the exam, that's accepted in the exam. But the bottom line is that if the residual risk is greater than 0%, then the risk has not been avoided. Transfer. Transfer involves shifting ownership of a threat to a third party to manage the risk and to bear the impact if the risk occurs. This response also appears in the PRINCE2 guide. Transfer is a response that 60% of my students get wrong. It means attempting to give the risk to somebody else. The most usual methods are by outsourcing and insurance. Well, why did I say attempting to give the risk to someone else? What I mean is that if you're building offices as a part of your project and the office is destroyed by fire, the insurance company hopefully will pay for the damage. However, there have been cases in the past where the insurance company has gone bankrupt and hasn't been able to pay up. Okay, but even if they do pay up, you now have to rebuild the office, and you have to clear the site before you rebuild the office, which might hold up your entire project. So by transferring the risk, you have created a secondary risk. The trick is also to transfer to an entity that is outside the commissioning organisation. Where my students usually get it wrong is they say something like, our team does not have the necessary skills for a major task, and so we transfer the risk to a more experienced team. Or we can transfer this risk by employing an expert. Both of these are wrong because the organisation is responsible for the work of all of its employees, and so they would still own these risks. They own the risks of the other team or the other department you're transferring to, and if you employ an expert, they would own the risks of the expert. Risk transference usually involves payment of a risk premium to the party taking on the threat. Transfer can be achieved by a range of actions which include the use of insurance, as I mentioned, performance bonds, warranties, guarantees, etc., or of course by outsourcing the work. Mitigate. In risk mitigation, action is taken to reduce the probability of occurrence and or impact of a threat. For example, the explosives that you're manufacturing may explode if hot. You can reduce the probability by having efficient air conditioning, and you can reduce the impact by having many small machines producing small quantities of explosives rather than one large machine producing enough to blow up an entire city. Early mitigation action is often more effective than trying to repair the damage after the threat has occurred. Examples of mitigation include adopting less complex processes, conducting more tests, choosing a more stable seller, developing a prototype to test and perfect, before committing to a full-scale product. Another method is to design redundancy into a product. For example, a computer is critical on a spacecraft, and so you can build in extra computers which will automatically take over if one fails. Except risk acceptance acknowledges the existence of a threat, but no proactive action is taken. This strategy may be appropriate for a low priority threat. It may also be adopted where it is not possible or cost effective to address a threat in another way. 90% of my students get this one wrong. Basically, when accepting a risk, you simply acknowledge that it can happen, and you record in the risk register that you're not going to take any other further action unless it does. Please note that you don't try to make up any other actions at this time or plan, because this means you're actually using a reduce strategy, and you can't devise contingency plans to use if the risk occurs. You simply record it and monitor it, and if the risk does happen, then and only then will you create a plan, and that plan is not called a contingency plan. When you make up a plan on the spot, it's called a workaround plan. Acceptance can be either active or passive. Passive acceptance involves no proactive action apart from periodic review of a threat to ensure that it does not change significantly. The most common active acceptance strategy is to establish a contingency reserve, including amounts of time, money or resources to handle the threat if it occurs. But even if an active acceptance response, you don't actually do anything with the risk until it occurs. Tools and techniques number 5, strategies for opportunities. 5 alternative strategies may be considered for dealing with opportunities as follows. Escalate. This is handled the same way as the escalate response for threats. The risk response strategy is appropriate when the project team or project sponsor agrees that the opportunity is outside the scope of the project, or that the proposed response would exceed the project manager's authority. Escalated opportunities are managed at a program level, portfolio level, or other relevant part of the organization, and not at the project level. The project manager determines who should be notified about the opportunity and communicates the details to that person or part of the organization. It is important that ownership of the escalated opportunities is accepted by the relevant party in the organization. Opportunities are usually escalated to the level that matches the objectives that would be affected if the opportunity occurs. Escalated opportunities are not monitored further by the project team after escalation, although they may be recorded in the risk register for information. The exploit strategy may be selected for high priority opportunities where the organization wants to ensure that the opportunity is realized. This strategy seeks to capture the benefit associated with a particular opportunity by ensuring that it definitely happens, increasing the probability of occurrence to 100%. Examples of exploiting opportunities may include assigning an organization's most talented resources to the project to reduce the time to completion, or using new technologies or technology upgrades to reduce costs and duration. Next one is share. The share response for opportunities parallels the transfer response for threats. Sharing involves transferring ownership of the opportunity to a third party so that it shares some of the benefits if the opportunity occurs. It's important to select the new owner of the shared opportunity carefully so that they're best able to capture the opportunity for the benefit of the project. Risk sharing often involves payment of a risk premium to the third party taking part in the opportunity. Examples of sharing actions include foreign risk sharing partnerships, teams, special purpose companies or joint ventures. Enhance. The Enhanced strategy is used to increase the probability and/or impact of an opportunity. Early enhancement action is often more effective than trying to improve the benefit after the opportunity has occurred. The probability of occurrence of an opportunity may be increased by focusing attention on its causes. Where it is not possible to increase the probability, an enhancement response might increase the impact by targeting factors that drive the size of the potential benefit. Examples of enhancing opportunities include adding more resources to an activity in order to finish early. The accept response for opportunities is similar to the accept response for threats. Accepting an opportunity acknowledges its existence, but no proactive action is taken. The strategy may be appropriate for low-level opportunities, and it may also be adopted where it's not possible or cost-effective to address an opportunity in any other way. Acceptance can be either active or passive. The most common active acceptance strategy is to establish a contingency reserve, including amounts of time, money or resources, to take advantage of the opportunity if it occurs. Passive acceptance involves no proactive action apart from periodic review of the opportunity to ensure it does not change significantly. Please note for the exam, in previous years, a popular question similar to which risk response is common to both opportunities and threats, the answer was the accept response. But with the 6th edition of the PMBOK guide, the newly added escalate response is common to both as well. And so you may get a question on the exam asking which responses are common to both the positive and negative risks, which are escalate and accept. Tools and techniques, contingent response strategies. Some responses are designed for use only if certain events occur. For some risks, it's appropriate for the project team to make a response plan that will only be executed under certain predefined conditions. If it is believed that there will be sufficient warning to implement the plan. Events that trigger the contingency response, such as missing intermediate milestones or gaining higher priority with the seller, should be defined and tracked. Risk responses identified using this technique are often called contingency plans or fallback plans and include identified triggering events that set the plan into effect. Please remember for the exam, a contingency or fallback plan is created before the risk occurs, but a workaround plan can't be created in advance. Tools and techniques number 7, strategies for overall project risk. Risk responses should be planned and implemented not only for individual project risks, but also to address overall project risk. The same risk response strategies that were used to deal with the individual project risks can also be applied to overall project risks, but please note that the avoid response is different for individual risks and overall risks. Avoid, where the level of overall project risk is significantly level and outside the agreed upon risk thresholds of the project, an avoid strategy should be adopted. With individual risks, the residual risk had to be 0%, but with the overall project risks, the overall residual risk must be within the thresholds. I can see this confusion a lot of people on the examination. An example of avoidance at an overall project risk level would include removal of high-risk elements from the scope of the project. Where it's not possible to bring the project back within the thresholds, the project may be cancelled. This represents the most extreme degree of risk avoidance, and it shouldn't be used if the overall threat of risk is and will remain unacceptable no matter what you do. Exploit, where the level of overall project risk is significantly positive and outside the agreed upon risk thresholds for the project, an exploit strategy may be adopted. This involves taking focused action to capture the positive effects of uncertainty on the project as a whole. An example of exploiting at an overall project level would include addition of high benefit elements to the scope of the project to add value or benefits to the stakeholders. Alternatively, the risk thresholds for the project may be modified with the agreement of key stakeholders in order to embrace the opportunity, transfer or share if the level of overall project risk is high but the organisation is unable to address it effectively. A third party may be involved to manage the risk on behalf of the organisation. Where overall project risk is negative, a transfer strategy is required which may involve payment of a risk premium. In the case of a high possible overall project risk, ownership may be shared in order to reap the associated benefits. Examples of both transfer and share strategies for overall risk include setting up collaborative business structures in which the buyer and the seller share the overall project risk, launching a joint venture or special purpose company, or subcontracting key elements of the project. Mitigate or enhance. These strategies involve changing the level of overall project risk to optimize the chances of achieving the project's objectives. The mitigation strategy is used where the overall project risk is negative and enhancement applies when it is positive. Examples of mitigation or enhancement strategies include replanning the project, changing the scope and the boundaries of the project, modifying project priority, changing resource allocations, adjusting delivery times, etc. The accept strategy for overall risk. Where no proactive risk response strategy is possible to address overall project risk, the organisation may choose to continue with the project as currently defined, even if overall project risk is outside the agreed upon thresholds. Acceptance can be either active or passive. The most common active acceptance strategy is to establish an overall contingency reserve for the project, including amounts of time, money or resources to be used if the project exceeds its thresholds. Passive acceptance involves no proactive action apart from periodic review of the levels of overall project risk to ensure it does not change significantly. Tools and techniques number 8, data analysis. A number of alternative risk response strategies may be considered. Data analysis techniques that can be used to select a preferred risk response strategy include alternatives analysis. A simple comparison of the characteristics and requirements of the alternative risk response options can lead to a decision on which response is most appropriate. Cost-benefit analysis. If the impact of an individual project risk can be quantified in monetary terms, then the cost effectiveness of alternate risk response strategies can be determined using cost-benefit analysis. The ratio of change in impact level divided by implementation cost gives the cost effectiveness of the response strategy, with a higher level of ratio indicating a more effective response. The exam can trick you in this one. Sometimes use a benefit cost instead of cost benefit. For example, a cost benefit of 2 to 3 means you obtain $3 of benefit from each $2 spent. With a benefit cost of 2 to 3, that means you obtain just $2 benefit with each $3 spent. Tools and techniques number 9, decision making. Techniques that can be used to select a risk response strategy would include multi-criteria decision analysis. Planned risk responses outputs. Output number 1, change requests. Planned risk responses may result in a change request to the cost and schedule baselines of other components of the project management plan. Change requests are processed for review and action through the Perform Integrated Change Control process. Output number 2, project management plan updates. Any change to the project management plan goes to the organization's change control process via a change request. Components that may require change requests for the project management plan include schedule management plan, cost management plan, quality management plan, resource management plan, procurement management plan, scope baseline, schedule baseline and cost baseline, which is a heck of a lot really. Output number 3, project document updates. would include the assumptions log, cost forecasts, lessons learned register, project schedule, the project team assignments, because once the assignments are confirmed, the necessary resources should be allocated to each action associated with a risk response plan. These resources include suitably qualified and experienced personnel to execute the agreed upon action, usually within the project team. A specific budget and timelines for the action and any required technical resources to complete the action. Then there's the risk register. The risk register is updated when appropriate risk responses are chosen and agreed upon. Updates to the risk register may include agreed upon response strategies, specific actions to implement the chosen response strategy, trigger conditions, symptoms, warning signs of a risk occurrence, budget and schedule activities required to implement the chosen responses, contingency plans and risk registers that call for their execution, fallback plans for use when a risk has occurred and the primary response proves to be inadequate, residual risks that are expected to remain after planned responses have been taken, as well as those that have been deliberately accepted, and secondary risks that arise as a direct outcome of implementing a risk response. Then there's a risk report. The risk report may be updated to present agreed upon responses to the overall current project risk exposure and high priority risks, along with the expected changes that may be expected as a result of implementing those responses. And that brings us to the end of a very long plan risk responses. The next lesson is 11.6, implement risk responses. Please read the corresponding chapter in the PMBOK guide before watching the video.